I am going to talk a little bit about the Women's Airforce Service Pilots. The Paperdolls, pinups, and pistol packing mamas. And they did. They were. How many of you have heard about the WASP before and know something about them? Okay? Now, I had never heard anything about WASP other than the insects that sting me, and I don't like them very much. But one day, I was walking through the stacks of a library where I lived. And I like to do that. You know, I'm a storyteller. That's what I do. That's what has driven me for the last 30 years, is to share stories. So I spend a lot of time in libraries, and I've been told that as a storyteller, I am one of them that does the deepest research and just always is digging out something about the story, whether I'm going to tell that part of it or not, just foundationally. So I spend a lot of time in libraries just walking around and instinctively just seeing what might come around. There I was, walking along, when all of a sudden, this book was on the shelf in a special little stand. And I went, Yankee Doodle gals, what? What is that about? So I took it off the shelf, I picked it up, and I went, WASP? Women's Air Force Service Pilots? I never knew anything about this. And I started leafing through the book, and I was really happy that it was a young adult book with lots of photos and very little text. It made it very easy for me to read and find the information quickly and get hooked. Hooked into the stories of the WASP. The WASP. Now, they were a portion of civil service, not military service. And I see there are some military folks listening to this. And I'm always tread very lightly because I know very little about military service. But I do know that the WASP at that point in time were only civil service and not military. But they had a very convoluted beginning. And isn't that the way it is in the military? That things aren't always easy and straight-lined. It's kind of, Well, this is how it was with the WASP. Briefly, I'll tell you this, and there's much more information about it, but that's for another day, another time. They started with two women who had two different ideas. One woman was Nancy Love, and the other woman was Jaqueline Cochran. Now, Nancy Love had the idea that she could bring highly qualified, trained women to become ferrying pilots. And it would be a very small, very elite group. And they had high qualifications, much higher than even the men's pilots' qualifications, the male pilot qualifications. So she had proposed this to the ferrying division, that let's have some women come in and help with ferrying these planes around the country. Good idea. It was being considered. Now, at the same time, Jaqueline Cochran wanted to start a women's training division. Right? Oh, but she didn't want just to ferry the planes. She wanted to train lots of women, lots of female pilots to fly. And the standards, the qualifications to enter wouldn't be nearly as high as they were for Nancy Love's group. But they would be trained, and they would do many different tasks for the military other than just ferrying planes across the country. So the two groups, the first one, the ferrying group, was called the WAFs, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. And that was their task, was to just ferry planes from point to point. The Woof Teddies, the Women's Flying Training Division, was the training school that Jaqueline Cochran had envisioned. There's a whole lot of history in that. You'll have to read more about it another time. But eventually, with a little bit of discomfort and a little rivalry, the two groups were finally joined under Jaqueline Cochran's administration, with Nancy Love still taking care of the ferrying group, and they became the WASP, jointly, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. There were 25,000 women who applied, 25,000 women back in 1942-43 who applied to become WASP. 1,800 were accepted for training. 1,102 actually graduated and became WASP. Tell you more about those as we close out today. They were amazing women. The woman I want to talk with you about next was Barbara Erickson. Now, you may wonder, why am I going to tell you about her? Barbara Erickson. Are any of you familiar with that name at all? Barbara Erickson, she later married Jack London, not the famous author, but London. She was from Seattle. She went to Roosevelt High School, went to UW, but while she was at the University of Washington, taking home economics as a major, remember it was 1942, right? There was a program called the Civilian Pilots Training Program, the CPT. And mostly that was for male pilots. And mostly, General Hap Arnold said, let's use this as kind of a camouflage, that we can train civilians and get our Air Corps stronger because we're behind. We're behind what Europe has in air power. We need to fortify this. So let's start training civilians, but kind of quietly through the universities and through civilian training. And Eleanor Roosevelt got wind of this and she said, at least 1 out of every 10 of those trainees needs to be a female. And so it was that Barbara Erickson became one of the CPT trainees and became a pilot there in Seattle. She was a great pilot. She loved it. See, Barbara Erickson had always been sort of an adventuresome kid. When she was 6 years old, her folks put her on the ferry from Bellingham up to Alaska, up to Juneau, 6 years old, by herself. Yeah. And she thought that was terrific. She was always kind of that sort of adventuresome person, but very serious-minded and very focused on achieving and doing it right and doing it well. And so she became not only a pilot through the CPT, but she also became an instructor. She got her instructor ratings and helped other people learn how to fly. Trained the men, many of the men that were there learning to fly. She had a job as a flight instructor. Matter of fact, in June of 1943, she had a job to be a flight instructor over in Spokane. But when she got there, you see, like on the West Coast, it had been blacked out and she couldn't fly over there. And so she wanted to leave Seattle because she loved flying. And so she went to Spokane for this job. But she got there and they really didn't have a job for her. And they said, why don't you go down to Walla Walla? There's a job down there. And so Barbara Erickson ended up here in Walla Walla as a flight instructor. Yeah. And then one day a telegram came through to Barbara asking her if she would like to apply to be one of the WAFs, one of the originals. Those were only 25 women that could do that. Air Transport Command, Ferrying Division, establishing group of women pilots for domestic ferrying. Stop. Necessary qualifications are high school diploma, education, age between 21 and 35, commercial flying license, 500 flight hours. Stop. At that time, male pilots were only required for 250 hours, and they only had to be 18 years old. Report at once to Wilmington, Delaware, Newcastle County Airport at your own expense, for an interview and flight check. Stop. Bring 2 letters of recommendation, proof of education, and flying time. Stop. George Arnold, Commanding General, Army Air Force, Washington. Barbara was here in Walla Walla. She got the letter. And now maybe some of you folks can help me more with this because I've only got a tidbit. In an oral history, she said, so I went to my boss, Herman. Who was Herman? Out at the airport then. I went to my boss, Herman, and I told him that I'd been asked to do this. And he said, well, sure, you should go. You should do this. And so she got in her car, she drove to Seattle, she talked to her parents and said, what do you think? And they said, well, what do you think? Should you go? It's up to you. And so she bought a ticket, got on the train, and took off for the east. But when she got to Spokane, a funny thing happened. Eleanor, who had been the secretary here in Walla Walla for the airfield, jumped on board with Barbara, decided she needed a change of life, wanted something to do, and so she stowed away in the upper berth with Barbara, and they made it all the way to Delaware. Now, when they got there, Barbara went in to talk with Nancy Love and, show her credentials, her qualifications, her letters of recommendations, her logbooks. And Nancy Love looked at all of it and said, yes, you're approved as soon as you have your flight check, right? And that we know that you can do this. Okay. Barbara wasn't quite in yet. But Eleanor had a real piece of luck, and I don't know who Eleanor was either, so if anybody ever has that information, please let me know. So Eleanor just happened to fall into a job. Nancy Love's secretary had just quit the day before in a huff. And Nancy Love hired Eleanor immediately as her new secretary. So the stowaway was hired on as a WAF assistant. And Barbara had to go up and take her flight check in a PT-19, she said. And she had never flown one of those before, but you just got to pay attention and figure it out while you're up there and There you go. She passed. She went on to become that serious-minded person that she was, to become very essential in the WAFs, in those originals. So much so that she was given squadron leadership over in Long Beach, California. She was sent there to take care of the ferrying division in Long Beach. Just a young woman, 21, 22 years old. And then, on a summer afternoon, see, the WAFs, they were ferrying these planes all around the country. And maybe most of you know what those planes were like. They were slow, small, pretty fast for the times, but what we would think is pretty slow. And they were solo. These women were flying these planes all by themselves, all on their own. Now the thing is, not only, to my understanding, and people can correct me and educate me if I'm wrong, but for the most part I have heard from other pilots that your pilots are pretty much trained kind of in one sort of plane, and they know that type of plane, and that's pretty much what they fly. The WAFs, and subsequently later the WASP, they were flying every different kind of plane there was, right? So Barbara, in this July afternoon, July 29th, she was sent from Long Beach to Indiana in a P-51 Mustang, a pursuit plane, right? Got there in that day, dropped it off. And they said, well, we need this P-47. P-47 is not a P-51. P-47, the jug, big and heavy. So it's a little different operation. We need it back in California. So she flew it back. She did a ROM. She did a rest overnight, or a stay overnight in San Pedro, and got the P-47 in. And they said, well, we need this C-47 taken back to Indiana. And each time it was a different airfield. It was never to the same base, the same airfield. It was always a little bit different one. C-47. So she took the C-47 back to Indiana, stayed over for a couple days because she did some work at the executive level and that kind of thing. And then they said, okay, and now we need this P-47 taken back to California. So from July 29th to August 6th, she did 5 days of flying, flew 8,000 miles in 4 different trips, 4 different planes, 4 different planes, substantially different planes. And she received the Air Medal for this accomplishment. And when she was awarded at the ceremony, she said, it was the luck of the draw. I had good weather, I had good planes, and I didn't do anything that we don't all do. She gave the honor to all of the WAFs for her receiving this honor. Anybody could have done it. It just happened to be me, she said. She was quite an inspiring woman. And she was here. She was here in Walla Walla. So this I put up for you about perceptions, public perceptions of what were the WASP, who were these women that would fly. Barbara Erickson there. And then, who looks pretty serious. I mean, would you doubt her Would you trust her with your life? You know, does she look like we're going to make this happen? And then there was also, you know, the 40s cheesecake kind of. You got to sell it, right? You buy them, we'll fly them, right? Defense bonds. Betty Grable was popular. Well, why not, right? Cover of Life magazine. Shirley Slade. Now this was actually when WASP, this had become WASPs now at this point. Shirley was a young WASP trainee when they took this picture. The girl next door. Doesn't she look like? He said, the pilot was a girl. Everyone was amazed. Shirley went on eventually and went to bomber school and was flying the B-26. I think she didn't keep her hair in pigtails at that point, right? And then there was, you know, the romantic side of being a female pilot, right? Cover of Love magazine. And then there was Ladies Courageous, or as the WASPs called it, Ladies Outrageous. Yeah, they were outrageous women. They were wonderful women. But most of the WASP didn't like this movie. Have any of you ever seen it? It's on YouTube. You can watch it full length on YouTube. And I think I found it by Googling Loretta Young, maybe. I recall Loretta Young. But, the WASP were not charmed by this movie because it just didn't quite represent the reality of their lives. This is what it was. These were WASP. They were hard-working ladies. They took their jobs very seriously. They had a great time. They all wanted to fly. I mean, that was the reason they were doing this, was to fly. But many of them had other reasons as well. They had fathers, they had brothers, they had husbands who were in the military, who were pilots. And they said, I can do this part to support them. I can help by getting the planes across the country. I can get the planes to where they can pick them up and where they need them. I want to do my part too. That's what so many of these women said. There's nothing too glamorous about it. It's cold up there. You're flying through all kinds of conditions. The weather changes if you're going totally across country. You might travel across 12 states. You might travel through 4 or 5 different weather cells trying to figure it out. And you're doing it all without GPS, without cell coverage. And you're following railroads to keep you on track. You're doing your instrument panels, hoping that the instruments are right. You're looking for landmarks along the way. If you can just sort of stay on track to where you need to go. Cold and lonely and uncomfortable. Long flight for a lady. And it was dangerous. Women defied death to ferry planes. So there was some public perception also of the seriousness of what they were doing. Defying death. Why was it so serious? They were just flying a plane across the country. Oftentimes, those planes were either fresh off the assembly line, and the WASP was the test pilot. No one else had ever been in that plane, had never flown that plane, and the WASP would be the first one in it. or the plane might be a refurbished or even a redlined plane that needed to get somewhere to be disposed of. Might be refurbished and they're not quite sure if it's going to work or not. They always said that after they'd done repair on the plane, they always let a WASP try it first because they were more expendable. They also were flying tow targets. Okay, so they would be up there in a plane towing basically a windsock, a large windsock out behind them. And ground artillery was training. These were training people to check their aim, their accuracy. And so they would fire at the target. And the joke always went, yeah, I see the target, but what's that thing up behind it? They were being shot at with live ammo, towing these targets. One woman, one of the WASP, when she came down, she had several shells that were in the fuselage of her plane, and she had the mechanic get them out, get the shells out. She took them into a jeweler and had a bracelet made. I always think of that as kind of that tribute, you know, how you have a bear claw necklace, you know, from all of your conquests, all your hunts. I always think of that when I think of her wearing this shell bracelet, you know, she had made it through. They also were flying night missions so that people, the ground crews could practice their spotlighting. Okay, so they were flying in the dark at night. And with blackouts. So oftentimes the runway wasn't even lit in any way for them. They just had to know what they were doing. And they also would be in dogfights. They would be doing air-to-air, and maybe they're flying with a crew, and so that crew can practice firing from inside the plane, right? So they were taking lots of risks by being ferry pilots. A lot of risks. It was dangerous. Hazel Ying Lee was a Portland native. Her parents were Chinese. She was born in the U.S. along with her other 7 siblings in Portland. And she became one of only 2 Asian Americans that were WASP. Hazel was well loved and a bon vivant. She loved life. All of the other WASP who knew her they wanted to be with her because she was accurate, she was precise, she knew what she was doing and how to fly, but she was also lots of fun and loved a good joke and loved to play. Right? She tells some great stories. I would love to tell you the full story of Hazel sometime because she was amazing. Hazel was one of the 38 WASP who died in service. She was flying a King Cobra P-63 from New York, eventually out to Great Falls, Montana, end of November. Blizzards going, planes stacked up, and when they came into Great Falls, you know, everybody's buzzing around. There was confusion in the tower. There was a plane coming in whose radio was inoperable. Hazel was also coming in. The tower saw that there was going to be a collision. The tower called out, "Pull up, pull up." Hazel heard the command, but the plane above her didn't have a radio, didn't hear it, and was a collision, a fire. The other pilot had very minimal injury to a foot, and Hazel died 2 days later from the burns that she suffered in her crash.
So the work that the WASPs were doing was dangerous work. And like Hazel, there were 38 who died in service. One of those came from right here in this very area. Now, are any of you familiar with a woman named Catherine Applegate? She was born in Dayton in 1905, and she went to high school. And then she came into Walla Walla and went to Whitman College. She transferred from Whitman. And then eventually, she found herself being accepted. One of 70 out of 700 that were accepted that year to go to Stanford. The girl from Dayton, she ends up in Stanford. Right. And after 4 years there, she graduates with a degree in psychology. Now, I told you that Barbara Erickson was an adventuresome sort and really always kind of pushing the edges and an excited woman. But Catherine Applegate, she was something else. Catherine Applegate always looked for adventure, always looked for the next thing to do, always wanted to be trying something else, and had a brilliant mind, obviously, to go along with it. So, after graduation, Catherine convinced one of her friends from Berkeley to stow away on a cruise liner to Hawaii. And they made it. They got on board. And they were out at sea before anyone ever discovered that they were even there on the ship. When the crew member found him, he took these two women to the captain. The captain said, "There is another ship that's coming eastbound, and we will cross paths. And when we do, you ladies will be transferred over to the other ship." Well, as the Matsonia neared its meeting with the Maui, Catherine and her Berkeley friend began to feel so ill, so overcome with the symptoms of intense seasickness, that the ship doctor said that there was no way that the ladies could be transferred and they would just have to stay aboard. They finished their cruise. And when they docked there in Honolulu, the two women walked to the post office where they picked up the suitcases that they had shipped ahead of time so that they would have appropriate clothes for the island living. Life was good. But she didn't stay for long. 6 months later, she decided it was time to go back to the mainland. Now, when she went back to the mainland, she met up with a friend that she knew from Stanford, Leonard Keeler. And the two of them, they found employment together back at Northwestern University in Chicago in the crime lab. And Leonard Keeler, he was the inventor of the polygraph machine. And he and Catherine worked together. And they had quite a good business working there in the crime lab and solved many cases with their investigative skills. Now, yes, also Catherine had made a name for herself as a forgery expert and a handwriting expert. And in Chicago, as an expert witness, she was well liked. She was tall and poised, sharp-witted, She made an impression. Now, she and Leonard had been married during this time, and the crime lab was sold from Northwestern University. And so Leonard and Catherine opened their own business, but it was difficult. And Catherine thought maybe she would go a little bit different path. And so she started her own detective agency with all women. Yeah, the #1 ladies detective agency in Chicago. That's right. Now, that caused a little bit of a marital rift because often the two of them, Leonard and Catherine, were going for the same clients and working on opposing cases sometimes, or were in competition. And during that chaotic time is when Catherine met Rene Dussaq. Now, Rene Dussaq was a bon vivant. He was a big life, Cuban, born in Argentina, and a world-class athlete. Everyone was quite charmed by him, including Catherine. And so it was that Leonard and Catherine were divorced, and eventually Catherine and Rene were married. At the beginning of the war, Catherine and Rene were both approached by the OSS to work undercover missions. And Rene accepted the offer and became part of the OSS. He actually paratrooped behind German lines into France. And then he was reported killed. But I don't think that Catherine believed that, times being what they were and the situation being what it was. She did not join the OSS. She did not accept that invitation. And instead, she waited and she joined the WASP. Now, she didn't have the most flying experience. She didn't have the most connection. But when she graduated in February of 1944, her career rose quickly through the WASP. She graduated in February. Then she was sent to a base in South Dakota for her regular sort of WASP experience. And then she was sent to San Antonio, up in the administrative part of the WASP. And then soon after that, she was sent to headquarters in Houston. And she rose to become an executive in the WASP organization there at headquarters in a brief amount of time. For a woman who was working in the headquarters and who was instrumental in working for benefits that WASP would receive, there's very little said about her role. She's a bit of a mystery. The day after Hazel Ying Lee's accident, in November, Catherine was in Washington, D.C. She was meeting there. There was much controversy about disbanding the WASP. It had been announced in October that the WASP program was finished. And Catherine was there and had an intense meeting. And then she was going to fly that night from Washington, D.C. to Ohio. It was 5 o'clock at night, late November. The weather was terrible, and she was given permission to fly with instrument qualifications. They said, it's up to you. The weather's bad. You will be using instruments. And it is a pilot's decision then at that point to continue on or to overnight. She went ahead and she took off from D.C. in bad weather, crossing out of D.C., Pennsylvania, West Virginia, into Ohio. Now add to this mystery of the night that before she left, Catherine had told her sister that there was a safe deposit box. Catherine gave her sister the key, and she said, if anything should happen to me, take everything out of the box. Maybe she just knew it was dangerous. Maybe she knew, like all the WASP, that what they were doing was dangerous. Maybe she knew something else. I don't know. But also, she was carrying with her all of her own personal records. She had it with her there in that plane. But as she flew, the weather got worse. And as she came into Ohio, she started having problems with her instruments. She was having problems on her bearings. She was having difficulty not believing what her instruments were telling her. She said it looked like she was low on fuel. And then she kept seeing conflicting signals from the towers and not sure where she was at. She was disoriented. Somehow, for some reason, instrument failure, mechanical failure, weather, but she crashed, nosedived, very near Dayton, Ohio. The plane caught fire in the crash, and they say that most everything burned that was left in it. And Catherine, her body was returned here to the cemetery in Dayton, Washington. Catherine's fatal crash happened on November 26th, 1 week from today. She remains a mystery to me. I look forward to finding out more about Catherine and her life. Now, all of the WASP were amazing women. They were the pistol packing mamas. They flew 60 million miles in a 2-year program. You see, they started in 1942, and in 1944, the WASP were disbanded. On December 7th, 1944, the last class of WASP graduated there at Sweetwater, Texas. Hap Arnold, who had been the instigator of all of this, gave the final graduation speech. And he said, 2 years ago, I never would have believed that a young slip of a woman could fly a plane like this. But you have proven that you can fly wingtip to wingtip, and we honor your service. We will never forget you and what you have done for us. Now, on December 20th, from all the bases, the WASP were sent home. They had to make their own way back there on their own dime. They said, we'll still fly. We'd fly for $1 a year. Just let us keep flying. No. Rather than being given benefits, military status, they were sent home. The files were sealed, and they were not acknowledged as military veterans. They could not fly commercially. Some went on to fly as Air Force Reserve, later Air Force Reserves. Some opened up their own flying businesses, but many of the WASP never flew again after. They said that when they went home and people asked them, "What did you do in the war?" When they told them that they had flown military planes of all kinds, people said, "You did not." And so it became easier to just say, I worked for the military. And people could accept that. Now, what were they to do? Go home. Bring the country back to normal. Let's move on. But it wasn't quite that easy, because in 1976, the Air Force announced that they were going to have the first female pilots in the Air Force. And the WASP heard this and said, "Oh no, they are not the first. We flew too." And so they began to push for recognition. They began to ask to be recognized, to receive the benefits. And in 1977, President Carter signed a bill to honor them, to recognize them, and to give them full military status and a honorable discharge to all WASP who served, both living and dead. And then in 2009, President Barack Obama awarded them the Congressional Medal. And so they truly have been recognized and honored. In the storytelling world, there is a saying that no one is truly gone if their name is still spoken. And so I am going out to find more and more of the names of WASP, to find more and more of their stories, and to be certain that we will hear their stories. Their names will be heard, and they will not be forgotten. My name is Rebecca Hom. I'm a storyteller, and I am very, very happy to have shared this with you today. Thank you.
I'll start reading some of the questions here. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, can
Okay.
hear you very well.
So here's a question. I'd love to know more where you found the Barbara Erickson oral history. How did you find that and her connection to the Walla Walla Air Base?
I found that oral history through the archives down at the Texas Women's University. They hold all the WASP archives there and have really extensive files and information. It was just a snippet because I had believed that I had found that or had heard it somewhere, and I got back in touch with the librarians at TWU, and we helped track down that particular oral history. So, but they have abundant files. The stories go on and on and on. You can be there for days researching. It's wonderful. I get lost.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
I think so. Let's see.
I hope so.
So you can ask follow-up questions too if you want. Just keep typing if you like.
Right.
And then Holly Robinson asks, did any of them ever go into battle?
Hi, Holly. No, the WASP were not combat pilots. They were civil service pilots rather than military. Like I said, it took them 30 some years.
Oh, let's see. Sorry, she just got kicked off. She'll be back in a sec.
Okay.
There you go. Oh, hi. Now we can see.
Hi. Hee. So no, they were not combat pilots. They were responsible for delivering, ferrying the planes, doing those trainings. They were instructing male pilots, new, totally novice pilots, and they would instruct them. But they were not in battle at all, and they only flew domestically. They did not fly out of the US at all. If you want to know about during World War II, women who flew in combat, the Russian women pilots were called the night witches, and who were treacherous to my understanding. And then also women in Europe, in England. I believe, I'm not sure if they were flying combat, but they definitely were flying during war times, in war situations, bombing situations.
Interesting. Let me check the chat. Oh, there's a bunch there too. Let's see.
It's good to see all of you. Thank you so much for being here tonight and listening. That's great.
So we have a comment from Paul Narowski saying Jaqueline Cochran went to Britain and flew with the ATS, the Auxiliary Transport Service, which was organized to free male pilots for combat, especially during the time of need after the Battle of Britain.
Yes,
that's one of those.
That's right. And she was coming back from that when she found out that Nancy Love had been given permission to start the ferrying service. And Jaqueline wasn't very happy to find out that she'd been kind of one-upped. Went in and spoke with Arnold, Hap Arnold, about it quite forcefully. And then that's when the wolf teddies also then were created at the same time. So
wolf teddies. There's always good animal names with these groups. Teddies, teddy bears. I guess that's not quite an animal. Teddies. Let's see. Linda Brown notes, by the way, that the AUW mini grant, which is supporting this, she says they're happy to support this, and that the money is raised by the kitchen tour and the used book sale. So always keep those in mind too. Let's see. From Toby Anderson, what are some of the resources that you used for your research?
I'm sorry, the what?
What are some of the resources that you used for your research?
Well, the very first one that I showed on screen, that Yankee Doodle Gals, was the very first one that started me on the path. And so following that bibliography in the back of that book, I think a lot of it is just about curiosity. It wasn't anything I knew a subject about. I had no information about the WASP, but because I was willing to follow my curiosity, and that just kept unearthing things. So some of the other books, and I'll put a bibliography list on my website, and also I can share that here with the museum and have that put on the museum site attached to the recording.
And can you say what is your website address?
It's RebeccaHom.com.
Perfect.
Yes. And so Amelia Earhart's Daughters is the source. Also, a book from a journalist out of Portland is called To Live and Die a WASP. And I got a lot of information in this about Hazel Ying Lee, and also some information about Catherine in here. He did a really good job. This is about all 38 of the WASP who died in service. So, but I'll put up the bibliography at the website.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Toby.
From an anonymous attendee, are there any more family connections in Eastern Washington?
Yes, there are, and I'm sure there are even more. That's why I put this out there so that people will kind of keep feeding me information. Again, RebeccaHom.com. So if you know more, please contact me and feed more information my way. There is a local person whose aunt was a WASP, and he generously put me in touch with who was the daughter of the WASP. I would love to tell you that story again some other time, another event. This WASP sent home letters and postcards, all kinds of things to her family during her service. And the daughter of the WASP generously let me have access to those letters and make copies of them. So I would love to tell her story and share more of that. I think there's a lot of connections, and I think that people aren't always aware of them.
Let's see. Carol Lee asks, didn't one of them test pilot the plane that dropped one of the bombs over Japan?
Would you say that again? Test pilot that flew?
Did one of them test pilot the plane that dropped the atom bomb?
Well, that's another story for another day too. Yeah, there were two of the WASP that were recruited sort of sight unseen to learn to fly the bomber. That was the same as the Enola Gay that dropped the bomb in Hiroshima. It was the plane had a bad reputation at the time, and male pilots were very afraid to fly it. It was it had a terrible experiences. There was an accident up in Seattle, caused a great fire, loss of life. And it had a reputation for catching on fire. The engines would catch on fire. So Lieutenant Tibbets found these two WASP that didn't know much about that, took them and trained them for an infinitesimal amount of time, and had this bomber, and then took it on a tour out to New Mexico to show that this could be done. And that kind of assuaged all the fears. And if these women can fly this thing, we can fly this thing. And that sort of set the pace for the Marauder to be taken in and flown. So
let's see. Gwen asks, why were the records sealed after the WASPs were ended? Are there now available?
I'm not good at answering that question in totality, Gwen. I'm sorry. I believe the logic at the time, and it was really controversial when they were disbanding for a number of reasons, and we can go into that another time. But they said it was an experiment. You know, this was not an actual military program. It was an experimental program, and so they sealed the files. Was it a gender issue somewhat? You know, the times, I don't know that for sure. And as far as them being opened, thank you for that. Spur, I need to know that if those files are now totally accessible, like through the military or through the US Air Force. So, but they were sealed at time, and it became very difficult for these female pilots to actually, certify that they had flown like this. So.
I'll see, we have in the chat a comment from Lance Lambert. In the future, will you have the opportunity to give your presentation live at the Museum of Flight in Seattle?
Ooh, that would be wonderful. Lance, if you have connections, send me up there. I would love to do it when everything calms down and we're back to some sort of, open-faced events. I would love to do live presentations at the Museum of Flight. Thank you for asking. And I hope to just continue doing presentations in any number of places. So
yeah, let's see, and we can email and figure out if everyone connected later too. From Holly Robinson, how did they learn to fly so many different planes?
how did they
Learn to fly so many different planes?
Quotes that I've read from several of the WASP was just like, you had the manual in front of you, you looked it over before, and then you got in the plane. They really were winging it so many times. 6 months of training as WASP, but when it really came time to fly certain individual planes, it was just get in the plane and fly it. It's quite amazing. And that they flew everything from cargo planes to pursuit planes to, they'd go to bomber school, and learn the different bombers, but they would fly several different types. So it was remarkable that they were flying all of these and had to be able to fly so many different planes because they were ferrying these planes from factory to disembarkation, right? To get them sent out where they needed to go into combat. So.
See, in the chat, Julie says they were just winging it.
They were.
See, Pat Callahan asks, I was lucky enough to meet two of the original WASPs in 19 at a fundraiser for the Women in Military Service Association. They flew their own planes to the event. Oh, wow. I only wish I remembered their names. They had such wonderful stories to tell, and I was enamored with their stories. Thanks for bringing this to us.
You're welcome. Thank you. Unfortunately, I have never had the honor to meet face to face with any of the original WASP. All of this has just been from archives and readings and, trying to blow breath into that research and try and visualize these women. I do have all of the records of the graduation lists of each class for those years, and including the WAFs and all through 44W10, which was the last class in December of 1944. So if people think that they have a relative that they know or a name that they know, contact me. I can try and find that and start digging into more research about it. Also, if you know what state that they were in when they signed up as a WASP. A lot of my information is not the state they lived in subsequently, but where were they when they entered WASP service. We can find it through that as well.
Let's see, we have about 16 questions. I guess let's try to get through most of them real quick here.
Okay, I'll try not to talk so much. Sorry.
Oh, no, it's great. I'll try to read them real quick. Let's see, from Holly, why weren't they valued more? Why do you think?
Why do you think, Holly? um, I same as it is. And then at the end, when it was disbanded, the air battle had started to wind down in Europe in the war, and it was going into more infantry. So there were a lot of civilian male pilots in the States that didn't want to be inducted as infantry. And so they wanted WASP out of there so that they could serve as instructor pilots or ferrying pilots in the States, and not look at being infantry over in Europe. That was part of what was going on.
What did Catherine Applegate study at Whitman before she transferred?
I'm not sure what she studied in Whitman. She graduated from Stanford with degree in psychology. So haven't been able to find her records and information about her, certified information about her from Whitman. So if anybody has that information, I would love to see that too.
Yes, Julie says, great program, Rebecca. Have there been any more recent movies done about the WASPs? Kathleen Applegate's story seems like a great film.
Catherine Applegate's story, what?
Sounds like a great film. Have there been any more recent?
I hear there's something about Disney wanting to do some sort of movie WASP. So we'll see. We'll see how it comes out. Hope it's better than Ladies Courageous.
Yeah, that'll be great and interesting when that comes out, hopefully. Yeah. Let's see. Is there a biography available about Catherine Dussaq? No.
No. There, the information, like I said, the information on Catherine is thin, very thin. And there is a book, I hesitate, that is more centered about her husband, Rene. You can look that up and find out about him. And there is some information about Catherine in that book. But she is quite mysterious, and that the archives in TWU there's not much there. And yet she was quite prominent. She rose very quickly. Prominence. And yet there's not very much information about her. So
see a few comments. Gerald says, thank you, Rebecca. I look forward to learning more about the WASPs. It's truly remarkable to fly so many different airplanes from one week to the next. Paul says, a women's squadron of Romanian pilots flew medical evacuation missions, especially at Stalingrad, evacuating ground troops to hospitals. And Pat says, as always, a wonderful presentation, Rebecca. Thank you. Marilyn says, I have a World War II era overcoat from the Wrens, the British women in the service. I've always thought a story about them would be interesting. Margot says, I just read Fanny Flagg's story, the all-girls filling station's last reunion, which describes in part the WASP program. The book says there were 39 female casualties. Your information was there were 38. Can you talk about the source of it? Do you know what the difference is there?
I possibly is one who is lost and has never been confirmed dead. There was one WASP who took off and they never, she flew out of California, out from the coast in the fog, and that was never confirmed. Yeah. Just a brief reminder, the Fanny Flagg book is a novel. There are some very great nonfiction books out there about WASP, in particular WASP and the WASP history. So I just throw that out there.
Let's see. So is it thought that Rene Dussaq had something to do with his wife's demise.
Yeah, I don't know.
Got to prove it in a court of law.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
it's interesting.
Pat, I just shared in the chat also, he sent this link, wingsaccrossamerica.us/wasp. Christopher asks,
A great site.
African-American female pilots.
Not in the WASP. Jaqueline Cochran made the comment to, there were several African-American women who applied, and there is a quote from her that she says, I'm already fighting enough just doing this, that I can't take on that issue as well. Wasn't fair. I just found out, and I don't know enough about her to tell this story, but there was a female pilot from Tuskegee, and I want to tell her story. The Tuskegee pilots. So that would be fascinating. There was also, what's her first name? Rex Rote is her last name, Rex Rote. A Native American woman out of Montana was also a WASP. So there was Maggie and Hazel Ying Lee and the Ms. Rote that were non-Caucasian.
Let's see. Carol and Emily both basically asked, why was the WASP program ended?
Mostly because like I said, the air war was winding down in Europe. That's probably the biggest factor. There was a lot of controversy about it. And also, Jaqueline Cochran was not willing to have the WASP be put under like the Army, the WACs and some other female group. Said either we stand alone or we don't stand at all. And she took a very firm stand as far as not militarizing unless they were recognized solely as their own individual group. So that kind of added to the controversy. And then it was about, a lot of it was about male civilian pilot instructors in the US that did not want to be drafted into infantry. And so there was a real big push that women need to quit doing this job. We don't need you anymore. You know, you served us, now don't be taking this away from a man's job. That was boldly stated and right out there. So
Let's see, someone says, this was a great program. Thanks for sharing this information, and to the museum for hosting.
thank you.
Marilyn says, great program, Rebecca. I'm happy to finally hear it. Fascinating history. And then Pam asks, where will you be telling more of these stories here?
Where what?
Where will you be telling more of these stories?
All across the nation.
And hopefully at the Seattle Flight Museum soon too.
Yeah, Museum of Flight.
And
I want to be able to tell these just everywhere. The WASP came from every state, every single state in the country, and across all social classes. So you know, every state had WASP that came from there. So I would be thrilled to be able to travel and tell those stories every place.
yeah, well, that's in the chat, Julie's suggestion, you do a post-COVID trip to Alabama for that.
There was a great WASP, Evelyn Sharp out of Alabama.
Yeah. Let's see. Well, I guess I think that answers. Let's see. Pat Peterson has his hand up. I don't know if that is meant as a question. I'll allow you to talk real quick. Do you have a question?
Yes. wonderful evening, and kudos to the museum and to you too, Grover, for doing such a wonderful job. My husband and I heard Rebecca do the almost first presentation of her program. How long ago?
Oh, several years, yeah.
And I've heard it several times since, but tonight it was like in full bloom. A wonderful, a wonderful presentation, and informative and uplifting, and it piques the curiosity, which I think is something sorely needed in this time. So
Yeah.
thank you, Rebecca, and to the museum for providing a wonderful evening of information and energy.
Well,
Thank you, Pat. Thank
thank you for watching.
you. Thank you to the museum, to the Fort Walla Walla Museum for hosting this, and AAUW, I'm a member, for for making these programs possible. So thanks a lot. I appreciate the time.
Yeah, well, thank you. And let's see, let me remind you, we're going to be emailing a follow-up, so you'll get that. And that'll give you a link to where you can see this, or this recording. We'll have that on our website and our YouTube. So if you want to share this with other people as well that weren't able to be here today, you can do that. And also, somebody asked are you writing a book, Rebecca?
Yeah, it's in my mind, and also a play. I dream a play, so we'll see what comes out. But mostly, I'm a storyteller. Mostly, my energy comes from looking people in the eye and telling the stories. So,
I think that's all the questions, and we're really grateful to share the stories. And thank you all for being here to see that. And if you have any questions, again, you'll get a follow-up email, and you can also email me at info@fwwm.org. If you have more questions for Rebecca or for anything, we'll get you in touch. So thank you all, and have a great night. Thank you, Rebecca.
thanks.
Bye.
Bye.